Do you know one of my favourite childhood memories is me building sandcastles with my grandfather?
Really?
Yeah. Until Mum told me to put them back in the urn.
Well, I see that you've started this episode of the Constant Geekery podcast in a particularly dark fashion, much like last week, as I recall.
It does seem to be a bit of a trend at the moment, yeah.
Darker sense of humour. Now, look, we're adjusting our episode format a little bit today because we want to appeal to a wider audience, particularly as we're going to be talking about the Apple Spring event.
The rumoured Apple Spring event.
The rumoured Apple Spring event. And there's a lot of interest around that, so we're going to get almost straight into that topic. And now what we do each week on the show is we have a section for news, and then we have a main topic, and then we have something we call the Rumour Mill. And since the Apple event is basically just one giant rumour after another, basically the whole show is going to be the Rumour Mill, apart from one news story, if I may.
You may. What is your news story?
Well, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks ago, on the podcast, we were talking about cars.
We were.
And I happened to spot a news story about cars, and it is that there is a particular cargo ship called the Felicity Ace.
Yes, I saw that in the news. It's slightly on fire, isn't it?
It is slightly on fire in the middle of the Atlantic, and quite depressingly, it's got almost 4,000 VW Group vehicles on board, brand new cars waiting to go to their new owners.
Volkswagen Polos and Golfs.
Some of those, but also there's at least 1,100 Porsches on there, which seems harsh.
This makes me feel sad.
Of course, if they're Taycans, then the batteries are burning, and they're going to have a real job putting out that fire.
But how does something set alight with so much water around it? It reminds me of that IT Crowd episode where the woman's parents died at sea parks. Do you remember that one?
I do remember that one. That's a classic.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you've placed an order for a new Porsche or a VW Group vehicle, then no doubt they'll be using this as a reason why you won't be getting your car on time.
Which, yeah, because up until now the supply chain's been absolutely fine with new cars.
And VW have never sort of not hit deadlines when delivering new cars.
I've never waited 8 months for a new Volkswagen Golf.
There we go. Anyway, that sort of doubled up as a little bit of a rant there.
Yeah, we often do that in the format as well. Each week, it's normally Dave, to be fair, has a rant of the week. So that was kind of slightly a rant as well. So we're packing it in today, guys.
Yeah.
So if you're new, if you've not, you're perhaps discovering this through the algorithm. Heaven forbid that YouTube actually puts us in the algorithm, but if you do, maybe you might consider subscribing. And if you're listening to this on a non-YouTube platform, you can see our lovely visages at youtube.com/The Constant Geekery Podcast, if you're so inclined.
Excellent. You'll also find a link through to the main channel there, which has just gone north of 30,000 subscribers, which is quite exciting.
In some circles, we are considered to be a big deal.
Which circles are those people?
Very small ones.
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, so this is the Rumour Mill. We normally do a jingle for the Rumour Mill. So if we're doing a jingle, then it will be inserted here. And if we're not doing a jingle, then you won't have heard a jingle.
Hopefully there may be some kind of jingle because no expense was spared on that jingle.
Okay.
So
it is quite a good jingle.
It is, yeah.
Look, let's talk about this rumoured Apple event. And the date that appears to be doing the rounds, although I can only find a couple of sources for this. And this is one of the problems that you get with all of these rumours for Apple events, is that everyone's just repeating what everyone else is saying. And it's very difficult to see the wood for the trees. Anyway, 8th of March has been put forward as the date for the event. And as far as dates go, that's as good as any.
I don't think it will be the 8th of March, though.
Okay.
I think it will be the 15th. I think Apple will do what they did last time, which is get everyone built up into a furore and then just do nothing and then do it the week after.
That word Ferrari, that should be the name of like a bad Italian car, shouldn't it?
There are no bad Italian cars.
But if this is true, though, if this is the 8th of March, so we're recording, what's the date today? 21st. So we record on Monday.
21st of February, not March, by the way.
Yeah, sorry. And the podcast will go live on the Tuesday, which means next week's podcast, we weren't sure whether we would cross over with the announcement for the event. So we thought we'd actually talk about the event this week instead.
Yeah, just to be different.
In my head, that made sense. But
it doesn't really make any sense whatsoever. Okay. But my point is, I use the word furore because people are already talking about counting down to the announcement of the event that may happen on the 8th.
So that seems like an unnecessary amount of excitement.
Are we getting that desperate? I mean, we love Apple products, we love tech, but really, it's not like we're short of exciting stuff at the moment, is it? It's not like it's been like a hinterland of tech for the last few years.
No, but I think whether, some people they're Apple fanboys, I would definitely not put myself in that camp, or yourself, Pete. But what I do like about Apple is they know how to stage a good event.
They do.
And all these other companies, they try to copy it and they don't quite pull it off. And so I think there is a measure of excitement about the Apple event, and they do tend to keep things under wraps. And I think they also are maybe starting to play the game a little bit more and maybe releasing a few rumours here and there, seeding a few rumours that are sort of a little bit off.
I still think 15th of March. You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll see. It's entirely reasonable that Apple will do a spring event, whether it comes on the 8th of March or the 15th of March.
Or the 22nd of March.
Yeah, or the middle of April, like it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Could be any of these. I think some products are fairly obvious, and I think we maybe should start with that.
Okay. What's your first obvious product then?
iPhone SE 3rd edition.
Yeah. So the SE3, I think they're going to call it.
It does come after 2.
Normally.
And the reason why I think this is highly credible, well, there's quite a few reasons, but I have seen quite a few pictures knocking about of cases made for the iPhone SE. Now, I know that when the 13 Pro Max came out, and all of the iPhone 13 phones, I got sent the cases before the actual product release.
Did you?
So I already knew what was
and
going to be
were you
released.
embargoed?
No, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to spoil it for anybody. Not that I would have spoiled anything because everyone knew what was coming anyway. But I didn't feel the need to play that game. The same thing is true this time. I have been offered phone cases and I declined them because we haven't got through all of those. And
no, nor have we got an iPhone SE3 planned to look at.
So I think it's highly likely that the iPhone SE3 is coming. So what should we expect on the iPhone SE?
A15 Bionic, but probably clocked down.
Yeah, so they clocked it down in the iPhone 13 mini.
Yeah.
In the iPad 6 mini, it's clocked down as well.
Yeah.
So I think it runs at 3 gigahertz rather than 3.2.
It's still pretty formidable.
Oh, yeah.
For a phone.
There's nothing wrong with it. Yeah, you'll be quite happy with that. If it comes with an A15 Bionic of any type, I think it'll be good. I don't expect it to have the GPU performance that you get on the top models, obviously. So, this phone, the whole point of it is to have a cut-down price.
Yeah.
So I think it makes a lot of sense for them to give you that extra chip because of production. It's one less SKU to be making. So that kind of makes sense to me.
Definitely.
I think we'll probably see a similar sort of case. Design, similar sort of phone design, and still Touch ID. I don't think they're going to put Face ID on an SE.
What makes you think that? Do you think it's because it's more of a premium feature?
I think partly that, and it requires different camera technology, and I think that's just going to be more expense that they won't do for the SE.
To be honest with you, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because I know rumoured coming up that the new iPhone 14. It is the 14 will have Mask ID.
Well, it already does.
Does it? Don't work for me.
I've got the developer beta on my phone, but yes, it does open with a mask on.
But my point is that you don't mask your fingerprints unless you're wearing gloves, I suppose. So I always thought Touch ID. That why improve on that really?
I think Touch ID makes a lot of sense in a smaller device, and Face ID makes a lot more sense on a larger device.
I wish they'd bring it to the iMacs.
What? Face ID?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And MacBook Pros, obviously. In fact, any kind of computer as opposed to phone.
Can't help but think that they were planning to do that. I mean, this notch that we've got here on the new MacBook Pros is certainly large enough.
Until you pointed it out.
It's large enough to house the gear. Actually, yeah, I can see yours. I've never seen mine because I have it in dark mode, so it never intrudes upon.
Do you know what I have in dark mode?
Go on.
My jokes.
You do. probably the same size display.
Yeah, I would say so. It's that kind of sweet spot Goldilocks display, isn't it?
Yeah. What about 5G?
4.7 inch. There's some talk that there's going to be an SE Plus model.
I have heard this rumour. I'm more sceptical about that.
My feeling is that why would you hinder people getting 5G on that phone?
Yeah, I think it would make sense.
Not least of all the point you made about SKUs. You know, it's if you've got one modem that covers multiple devices, why would you deliberately go for a lesser modem when it probably makes sense on economies of scale to just have them all as 5Gs?
Well,
or 5G capable.
I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but because phones aren't really my area of massive expertise, but I've got a feeling that the modem is built into the A15 chip, and indeed the A14 has 5G.
Right.
Because my phone has it. But the current SE is 13, which probably doesn't.
No.
So if it gets the A15, I don't see why it wouldn't get 5G.
I suppose the only reason it might not is for the same reason it's going to be clocked down, is they could switch the 5G off in software. But I don't know. That seems a bit tight.
There's probably more to it because the current iPad Air has the A14 in, and the cellular models of the iPad Air are not 5G. So I don't think it's obviously not an automatic thing. You put in one of those chips, you get 5G. So.
And there's plenty of precedent for companies installing hardware that supports features that are turned off in software.
Not least the rather curious additional bank of machine learning cores that's inside the M1 Pro. No, not the M1 Pro. The M1 Max has an additional 16 machine learning cores which are not active.
Yeah, that's coming, I think.
I suspect so. I just think they'll switch the whole lot on when they do the Mac Pro. But we're digressing. We're talking iPhone SE.
Yeah.
I think it makes a lot of sense. It's the right time of year to release an SE because you want to get the flagship phones, you want to give them a good run at the market.
Yep.
And I think for most people who are going to buy an iPhone 13, they've probably bought it.
Probably.
However, I've noticed Apple's doing quite aggressive marketing campaigns for trade-ups. So they're inviting you to trade in your iPhone 12, which I did respond to one of these on Twitter, just sort of asking how does this exactly align with the environmental commitments that Apple supposedly has?
Because they're recycling them.
Are they, though? I would suggest that it would be more environmentally friendly to not trade in your 1-year-old phone and actually use it for a couple more years first before recycling it.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway, why would they be doing that? It kind of makes sense. It's just like if there's any who are sort of sitting on the edge, give them a decent trade-in price, push them over to do the upgrade, and then have a stab at the SE market, the mid-tier market, if you like.
Yeah.
And so the timing for me works. And I think, the current SE, so the SE2 was released in the spring event in 2020.
It was. So I think this is a no-brainer. They were also getting rid of stocks of older phones recently, weren't they? The older entry level. What was it? The iPhone, we talked about that.
It was the 8.
It was the 8. So,
because of course the current SE is the same chassis, isn't it, as the iPhone?
But more
8.
powerful. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that it's time for that. Targeting a price point of around about £450.
I think that's probably the area they need to be. If they can do it at 400, they'll be doing well, won't they?
Yeah, definitely.
But I wouldn't mind betting that they'll take the opportunity to put the price up a bit. So maybe 450.
Well, inflation and everything.
And based on Apple's methods of pricing, I should think that would be $450 as well. But who knows? I mean, we're purely speculating here. Now, what we usually do on the Rumour Mill is that we talk about a rumour and then we give it a traffic light grading system.
We do.
So obviously red meaning we don't think this is a credible rumour, amber meaning maybe, green meaning pretty solid.
Probably nailed on, isn't it?
So I think the question is, will we see an iPhone SE3 at the Apple Spring event, whenever that is?
Yes, I'm going to put that as a green.
I'm going to go green as well. Some of the features I wouldn't be quite so convinced on, but we'll wait and see on those. But if you're in the market for a decent handset, and I've got to be honest, I mean, I'm possibly going slightly off piste here into Dave Rant territory again. But
everyone loves it.
I have the iPhone 12 Pro Max, and I went for the larger screen. Sneeze time again. Here we go.
Every
2.
single time.
Go on, keep going.
I'm trying.
Honestly, I have to work with this every day.
It must be the lights.
Yes, clearly lights causing allergic reactions.
It's known that light can make you sneeze.
Sunlight can, yeah. There we go. That's 4. Any more?
Have you got a microfiber cloth or anything?
No.
Okay.
That's disgusting.
Where's... Yeah.
Some people they really make a big deal out of sneezing. Others are a little bit more subtle. Just saying.
Are you talking about the subtle sneeze where you just hold it, you go...
Yeah.
Yeah, and then get like an aneurysm or something like that?
That's
No,
my
I'm not
preferred
doing
way
that.
of doing it.
That wouldn't go well on the podcast, would it? Aneurysm live. It's just not a winner.
I suspect
People might notice that I'm not actually brain dead yet.
it might get some views. I went for the larger phone because I was struggling with the keyboard on the smaller phone, and it only dawned on me the other day that I never used to struggle with the keyboard on even smaller phones.
I did see you tweet about this.
And it seems to me that the autocorrect has gotten much worse on Apple devices. Now, hit me up in the comments there if you're in agreement with this.
Do you know, it's one of those things I've almost been afraid to say anything to anyone about because I'm thinking it's me. But I've come to that conclusion as well. I think it's since they put on the swipey thing so that you can swipe round to make up a word. I think it's just getting too clever for its own good.
But it's the suggestions as well. So I started a tweet, with the words "I probably," and the autocorrect changed it to "in probably." 2 words, I-N, and then probably. Whenever, in the use of the English language, have you ever heard someone say "in probably"?
Well, it seems pretty improbable to me.
That's a different spelling.
But I think, we are digressing, but I think this is maybe something for another podcast. We often have ideas, but phones, in fact, technology is getting too smart. I was writing a speaking piece the other day, and Microsoft Word was trying to suggest grammatical corrections. And some things are grammatically correct or incorrect. Other things are a question of your speaking or writing style, aren't they? And how you phrase things. So we both have different ways of phrasing things, but both are grammatically correct. But Word seems to want to push you down this route of saying, oh, no, why don't you do it this way? It's much more efficient to just use one word when you could use 2. And sometimes that is true, but sometimes when you're speaking, if you try and go down that route, it doesn't work out.
Yeah, very true. Let's save that for another day. Let me get to the actual point I was going to make.
Oh, sorry.
About the larger phone and the extra features that come on this larger, much more expensive phone. And the truth is that 99.9% of the time you don't use them.
True.
And if I had an iPhone SE, would I actually miss the additional features that come in this handset? I'm not convinced I would. I'm sure that's not true for everybody, but I think for a lot of people who buy the more expensive model, they probably don't need to. So there's nothing wrong with an iPhone SE.
I think the interesting point there is, despite us being fairly genned up on Apple stuff, I'm thinking, what features are those?
Well, it's mainly the cameras, isn't it? That's the additional...
I suppose when I am filming cinematography, cinematographic stuff, then I do want that rack pull focus.
Yeah, let's not get into that nonsense today, shall we? Let's move on. Another product which may appear at the event is an updated iPad Air.
This will be the 5th generation one.
It would.
So it would be an iPad Air 5?
Probably.
Yeah.
So what might we expect from an iPad Air 5? I think I'd go straight out and say I don't think they're going to radically redesign the iPad Air.
It's a really nice design at the moment, and Apple do seem to be keeping a chassis design for a couple of generations before going back to the previous version, which is pretty much what they seem to be doing now.
Indeed.
Rounded edge, square edge, rounded edge, square edge.
But they've used that same design on the iPad mini as well, so then to change the iPad Air might seem a little bit odd. So I think they'll probably keep it the same. I think it might just get the A15 in it, over the A14, although I've got to say, and we will talk about this in a bit more in a minute, that's not a massive upgrade.
No, it isn't. Having said that, the current iPad Air is a pretty good piece of kit. And I speak having an iPad Pro, albeit a couple of generations back.
So So the iPad Pro that you're using at the moment, it's got the A12X in it,
Hmm.
and the A14 Bionic on the iPad Air is faster for single-core performance,
Yep.
slower for multi-core performance,
Just.
and I think they're fairly similar on graphics performance. The Air probably just got the edge.
Yeah.
But I can't remember. It's been a while since I did the benchmarking. So there's not, the Air, and that iPad Pro is a fantastic
I love it.
iPad Pro.
Do you know what I particularly like about it?
Go on.
Round the edges, you've got the bezel of the screen.
Yeah.
You don't get any shadow,
Mm.
which I've heard some other iPad Pro models do have.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll talk about the M1 and the iPad in a mo. So those, I mean, I suspect it will get centre stage because the iPad Mini did.
Yeah. iPad Air's not got that at the moment.
Don't think so.
No.
So I think it'll get centre stage. 5G on the cellular models now
Makes sense.
would make sense. Otherwise, what else would you change about it?
I'd struggle. Maybe add a new colour.
Some new colours might be nice.
Maybe. Yeah. Just to say I have got the latest one.
They aren't very colourful because I got the blue one for my wife, and you're hard pressed to tell that it's blue. It's unless you put it up next to a silver one, then you can see it's blue.
It's very subtle, but
It is subtle.
I quite like that.
I do too, but it doesn't kind of marry up with the iMac colours.
Which are very vivid.
So maybe some better colours. Who knows?
Okay.
Let's talk about Macs.
Yes. How is
And-
he?
Yeah, this is a big problem now. Everything. I mean, why on earth would they call the chip the Max, MAX? Max with Max.
Yeah.
It's.
Big Mac.
I think they've. It's confused.
It is a little bit confusing. But there are 3 new Mac model numbers in the Eurasian Economic Database, aren't there? Or as I like to call it, the EED.
Yes, and
B.
you are absolutely right. I've just realised, of course, we didn't do our grading for the rumour about the iPad Air.
It's a green.
I'd say green. Okay. Yes, absolutely right. Last time we got new Mac model numbers in the Eurasian Economic Database. There were 2 that went in, and we got the MacBook Pro 14-inch and 16-inch model.
We did. But we've got 3 now.
So what are they? And will we see all of them at the spring event?
Well, let me answer the first question first. I think probably what we should do is go through these and grade them at the end.
Okay.
Does that sound reasonable?
Yep.
So I think the first one we can be expecting is a Mac Mini with Pro and Max chip options.
Okay, so I'd agree with that. I think a Mac Mini could definitely take a Pro or a Max chip. There's a lot of space in the chassis, but that kind of brings up a question because the chassis they're using at the moment is an Intel chassis. They haven't changed it since the Intel Mac Mini, with the exception of the ports on the back.
Which, is a valid thing because you might want to differentiate, just like you have with the new MacBook Pros. Hey, I've got not just Apple Silicon, but I've got a Pro or a Max chip. So I could see there being an argument for redesigning the chassis. Having said that, they are great designs.
They are. And I think we might see like a minor aesthetic change, but I think they might keep the footprint the same. And I'll tell you why I think that. It's because the Mac Mini is used in data centers as well. And so in order to get the Mac Mini into data centers, you have custom racks made up. And obviously they're all made up for the current sizes. And this has been happening since the Intel Mac Mini and now with the M1 Mac Mini as well, because you can spec it with 10 gigabit Ethernet, which makes it very useful in a data center environment.
It does.
Imagine it with an M1 Pro chip in the M1 Max. I don't know that you'd need the graphics performance in a data center, but M1 Pro certainly that would make a lot of sense.
It would.
So if they keep the footprint the same size, that would.
It's just going to make it more appealing, isn't it? I mean, Apple have got a history of,
changing things,
and then people have to go out and get new stuff and ancillaries for it. But I think in the Pro market, which this would be, that would make a lot of sense. Possibly one way they could differentiate is by some different finish options, different colours.
Yeah, perhaps maybe some beveling on the edge, perhaps.
Like they've done with the MacBook Pros.
possibly.
Just a bit of subtle bevel.
Perhaps back to the old ones, you remember, which had a sort of polycarbonate top sat inside a...
Yes,
So they
we've still
could do
got one of those knocking about somewhere.
We have, yeah. So you could do a blend of materials. There's all sorts of different things you could do with it.
RGB colour strip around it.
I imagine that'll definitely happen, Pete.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think Mac Mini is a pretty good contender for one of those model numbers.
Yes.
And to see a Mac Mini with M1, M1 Pro and M1 Max, a lot of people will be very happy about that.
Definitely. That will be quite awesome.
Okay, so what else might we have? Who are the contenders for the other two model numbers, sorry?
Okay, so a larger iMac, which we'll come back to in a minute. Potentially another 24-inch iMac, but with Pro Max chips in. And there are possibly some laptop considerations as well.
All right, well, let's save the laptops. Let's do the 24-inch iMac first, because I think that's that. I don't think you could put a Max in that 24-inch iMac.
Why not? Thermal? Yeah, of course you could.
Well, technically, yes, you could. So there are two models of iMac. One has a single fan.
Yeah.
You're holding that up to demonstrate that you could thermally cool an M1 Max.
You could. I mean, this is quite a modest M1
Okay,
Max.
so let me clarify what I meant then, Pete. From a commercial perspective, if you put M1 Max in a 24-inch iMac, do you not...
I see where you're going with it.
Whereas if you only put it in the larger iMac, wouldn't you then automatically get people to be spending more money? And Apple does like people to spend more money.
Well, as we've mentioned in the past, Tim does need something to retire on.
He does. He's only going to earn $100 million this year. So
yeah, and that's just going to go with the day-to-day, isn't it? So that could support something I'm going to come back to when we discuss the larger iMac in a minute. So hold that thought. So yes, maybe an M1 Pro only.
Possibly. Who knows? At the end of the day, we're speculating just as everybody else is. And I think, maybe we ought to just address that point.
Go on.
Just quickly. Because it seems like every man and his dog now is starting a tech YouTube channel where they're talking about the Apple event and all of the rumours. There's a lot of people starting out in this. And
we have been doing it you have been doing it for quite a few years now.
I have, but I don't tend to do the rumour stuff. If you type M2, for example.
No, sorry, I mean the tech channel.
Tech channel I've been doing for a few years, yeah. If you were to type M2 into YouTube, you'll get so much content back that would make you believe that actually this is a real thing that has been announced by Apple, and it hasn't.
No.
And what's happening is that all of these channels are copying each other's content or just putting out their opinions on it, and then in order to get the click traffic through so they can make the ad revenue, they
make it a done deal.
Yeah, they title it in such a way so that it and I think a lot of people will see through that and understand what they're doing, and they're just trying to make a living, and it's far from us to
cast aspersions on
exactly. But I do think it's a little bit confusing for consumers because a lot of people assume that the M2 is going to be released at this event.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that in a moment. But for now, let's keep it on M1 Pro and Max, and we're doing that deliberately, and all will become clear. So the larger iMac then.
Yeah. Now, the reason I think you might be onto something with the 24 only having the Pro in it is, and this is where it gets really confusing, but allegedly, and again, this is speculation and everything, but allegedly Apple were referring to the larger iMac as the iMac Pro.
Yeah, so
internally.
I see. So I've heard this rumour. It does kind of make sense. Big one, small one.
Yeah. And it would kind of, I know we're going to talk about this again in a minute, but it would line up with the MacBook Pro kind of concept. Maybe just trying to normalise things a little bit more. But anyway, either way, we're expecting either a 27 and or possibly a 32-inch iMac at some point. I would say probably a 27-inch is something we can probably expect at this event. Possibly a 32, and that may be our three models then, the Mini and two iMac sizes, bigger iMac sizes, possibly.
Yeah. So I think if we look at it at the overall transition, the larger iMac is the one that kind of stands out to me at the moment as the next one that needs doing.
Agreed.
Because we've got a replacement small iMac, I can't imagine that they're selling much of the 27-inch 5K Intel iMac at the moment. So it makes perfect sense to get this changed over. We've already got an M1 Mini, we've got an M1 MacBook Air, we've got an M1 MacBook Pro, we've got these Pro and Max chips for people who want a bit more oomph. So bringing out a larger iMac that also has the Pro and Max options is going to tick an awful lot of boxes and fill a lot of gaps in the terms of the transition. So if I were at Apple making those kind of commercial decisions, and bear in mind we don't have all of their information about supply chain and everything else, but that's the one I would be targeting for this event.
Yeah, I agree. It makes a whole lot of sense. And I think you've touched on something that's really important to state here, which is I think when Apple were planning the rollout of their Apple Silicon originally, they probably didn't have to factor in the supply chain challenges that have come up in the last 2 to 3 years. So I suspect that has changed their plans quite dramatically.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree that this is the next logical step in the roadmap.
Well, if they do this as the next step, they only then have one computer left to transition.
The Mac Pro.
The Mac Pro, and they've already got the chips for that, so that's not going to be a big deal, I don't think. So, well, it is a big deal, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And they can get that done this year, which is what they committed to. So by the end of this year, that everything's transitioned to Apple Silicon. Well, that's the easiest route to achieve that.
I agree.
It will upset some people.
I also agree.
I know a lot of people are waiting on more powerful Mac Minis. I don't think it's a particularly huge technical challenge for them to make the Mac Mini with the Pro and the Max in. So maybe they'll do that as well, just to cover all bases. Because then you've got to spread of laptops, haven't you, that really cover everything, and you've got desktops pretty much covering all bases as well. So those do make a lot of sense to me. So a question for you though: do you think the 27-inch iMac will have the same design language as the 24-inch?
This is one I flip-flop on because it depends whether there's a 32 in the works. I've always stated that there will be a model of iMac that will follow something along the lines of either the Pro XDR lineage or more akin to an iPad Pro on a stand kind of look. And I still think that will happen. The question is whether Apple consider a 27-inch iMac to be pro enough that it wants a slightly more, don't take this the wrong way if you've got a 24-inch iMac or think of buying one, but of more of a serious look than a multicoloured one does. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the new iMacs, personally. I think, and not so much that I love the colours, it's actually the front with that big bezel isn't for me. It looks like the sort of Apple device you might get from Wish, personally.
Of course.
So, I don't know.
We've sort of got Apple doing this anyway with the Pro XDR display getting an A chip in it.
Yeah.
Which we're not going to talk about now, but it would make sense to move that towards a professional iMac because it shares that design language. Of course, we say that, but we haven't seen the new Mac Pro yet, so we don't know whether they're going to keep the same design language or not. My feeling on the colours is that bright colours, and as we said before, they are brighter than, say, on the iPad Air. Bright colours look really good on smaller devices. When you get up to a really large device, that's quite a statement then, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be. I suppose you could argue that either way because it's like, well, if you don't like that, go for one of the more neutral colours, and if you want something more in your face, go for one of the brighter colours. So,
fair point.
I mean, we've always had this thing where Apple have kind of 3 bands. So they have consumer products, they have what we would call enthusiast products / prosumer products, and then they have the pro devices. So I guess the question we need to ask ourselves is, where would a 27-inch-esque iMac sit? I would say it would probably be in the enthusiast / prosumer lineup, particularly if it's got Pro and Max chips, which might suggest it will go with the slightly more neutral colourways that we get on the MacBook Pros.
Yeah, entirely possible. I can certainly see a lot of professionals buying them for heavyweight creative work, where you need to have a larger screen on the desk. So, yeah, makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
So what sort of display do we think we're going to have in it?
Very similar to what we've got in the MacBook Pros in a lot of ways. So mini LED, ProMotion, that's what's being mooted.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to see if they do that. I think that will push the price up a bit because the 24 inch isn't mini LED, is it?
No.
No. So, will they do that? Not sure. And what other features do you think will come?
Well, pretty much the same sort of port arrangements as you got on the MacBook Pro, but plus the Ethernet in the brick that you get on the 24 inch, which I think's pure Apple. That's such a great idea.
So you're thinking we'll get the 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, whereas currently, of course, because it's M1, it has USB 4 ports, 2 of, and also 2 USB ports as well on the more expensive one.
And an SD card reader.
Yeah. Where would they put it?
On the back or underneath.
Interesting.
Underneath would actually be quite better. What's wrong with my words today? Would be much better than the current arrangement on the old 27-inch where you have to scratch around at the back for it.
Yeah, and invariably break the things on the SD card. I'm not a fan of the SD slots on the iMacs because they're all on the back and that makes them very unusable.
Of course, one thing that is on the MacBook Pros that may not be on the iMac is a HDMI port.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why there couldn't be one.
Yeah, I don't think they will. I suspect we'd just see more Thunderbolt or Type-C ports of some description.
Yeah, that's probably likely. Starting spec is rumoured to be 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 SSD.
So it could be M1 or M1 Pro then?
Could be. But I'd be surprised if there's just a stock M1 in the bigger iMac. Honestly, I'd be surprised.
It almost makes sense for them to not put M1 in it and have M1 Pro. And I'll tell you for why. It's because the Thunderbolt controller is different, USB controller. So I alluded to this earlier. So the M1 products have USB 4 incorporating Thunderbolt 3. And the reason why they call them USB 4 ports is because they're not compliant with the Thunderbolt 4 standard. Now, Thunderbolt, these new machines do have Thunderbolt 4 in them, and having speed tested them on the channel, they are better than the M1. So if they do a large iMac with an M1 in it, then they're going to have a different port specification to if they do M1 Pro and M1 Max. So actually, kind of makes sense from just to offer M1 Pro, and if the starting point was 16 gigs of RAM, you always want to have an upgrade path.
Yeah.
And the M1 can't have more than 16.
No.
Whereas the Pro can go to 32. So I think larger iMac, M1 Pro as a starting point.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think also, if you're talking about the use case, we're talking about more heavyweight people using this, then you're probably going to want more displays than just an M1 can easily support. So that would add to that as well. Wouldn't it be great if they brought out a really nice display that matched the aesthetic, so you could literally have, imagine 3 of the same design aesthetic on your desk? Oh, that would be amazing.
It would be good.
And expensive.
Although, you probably wouldn't get much of a saving over the actual computer, would you?
No,
I suspect most of the cost is in the display and the chassis.
Definitely. You mentioned starting price, so rumours are that's going to be around about $2,000 and pounds.
It'd have to be.
If it's following Apple's, Which, to be fair, is comparable to what the 27-inch iMac always was, particularly when it first came out.
Yeah, they're not cheap computers, the 5K Intel iMac, particularly if you spec it up to something sensible. So, I think that's all quite likely. We said we'd maybe hang on to the end before we nail our colours to the mast, as it were. Let's just talk about laptops for a moment.
Yeah, you and I have both got different things we've heard or theorised about this.
So you've I've got a note here that you want to talk about MacBook Air.
Yeah, I understand that the chassis may not be able to support it as we understand the chassis to be now and as we understand the Pro to be now. But I could see a Mac, I'm going to say MacBook Air, but it might not necessarily carry that name, but something slimmer and lighter than a MacBook Pro that's carrying a Max, brain's gone dead again, M1 Pro in it.
Yeah, I don't think that. I can see the gap in the market, but I don't think the MacBook Air is the machine that they would put that into. I mean, the physical dimensions of the M1 Pro are larger.
Yeah.
So that is quite a significant change to the thermal design of the unit. The things that make the MacBook Air so compelling, and it is such a compelling laptop, you can get them for, what, £900 or so for the
Just
entry
under.
level
My
spec.
brother-in-law got one yesterday.
Yeah.
Came home with it, very pleased with it.
Excellent. Well, and why wouldn't he be? Because at that price point, there is nothing else that offers you the same combination of quality of build,
Yeah.
the quality of the screen,
Yeah.
the touchpad, the overall aesthetic, the battery life, the performance. It's unbeatable at that price point.
Yeah, it's incredible.
So, and I think that's where MacBook Air needs to be. It's a consumer device, and so the Pro chips don't belong in it. It should be a brilliant consumer level device, and by that I mean that's the one that your average punter would buy. But obviously, it's got lots of use for professionals as well. There's loads of guys who are using the MacBook Air for professional work, coding, creative work, even video editing on the 16 gig version. And it's a do-it-all computer, genuinely brilliant. Why would Apple change that?
Well,
what could they possibly do to make that significantly better without it costing them a fortune to do it?
Those are really valid points. So, I don't know. Just something in my water.
So I don't want to talk about your water. What I do want to talk about
Something in my bones.
is the MacBook Pro with Touch Bar. So
Really?
yeah. So the rumours are coming up that we're going to see a new MacBook Air with M2 in it at the spring event. We're going to see the new MacBook Pro with or without the Touch Bar, depending on who you believe, with an M2 chip in it as well. And I look at these things and I just think that doesn't make sense to me.
No.
I mean, the MacBook Pro 13-inch doesn't make sense to me anyway. It's clearly, I mean, it's an old Intel chassis. Actually, so is the MacBook Air, let's be fair. Apple is moving away from the Touch Bar. I'm not convinced that that's going to stay. If they keep a 13-inch chassis, I would assume they'd get rid of the Touch Bar.
So could we be talking about an amalgam of what I've been saying and what you've been saying, a MacBook?
Yeah. So let me just go through some naming conventions for you, because I feel like Apple is all over the place with this. But if you're going to have, we've got a Mac Pro. Really what we want is a Mac. And we've got a MacBook Pro. So really what we then want is a MacBook.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and really the Mac has always been, or for a lot of its life, I mean, the iconic Mac, let's say, is the iMac, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the Mac with the screen built in.
Certainly in, the last 15, 20 years.
So why not change it? Why does it need to be called iMac? Call it Mac. Then we have Mac Pro, or call the Mac Mini the Mac, or make a new Mac. Either way, what you've got here is an opportunity to create a 13-inch that sits between the thin and light, everyday carry, do-it-all notebook that is the MacBook Air.
Yep.
That isn't at the price point or the performance level of the MacBook Pro 14-inch, which is
I
at
follow you.
£1,900, so more double the price, basically. So something that sits neatly in the middle, that offers a slightly larger chassis to give you a bit more battery, which, not to extend battery life, but to allow you to have
A more
M1 powerful
Pro.
chip,
Yeah.
or indeed an M2.
Or indeed an M2.
That offers a bit more connectivity, a better screen, those kind of things, and call it the MacBook.
Yeah, that's missing. It's been missing for a while.
Yeah. Because actually, a 13-inch MacBook Pro is not really much different in terms of footprint and chassis size to the 14-inch MacBook Pro, is it?
No.
So it just seems to me to be a bit of an odd choice to continue investing in.
I don't think they'll continue. The only reason I could see that we will continue to see some kind of investment in the MacBook Pro 13 is if they've got loads of chassis left over, which I can't, supply chain.
That's possible. Yeah.
That would be the only reason. It wouldn't be a deliberate, planned choice. It would be almost a bit like putting the M1 in the iPad Pro. It was kind of a choice of pragmatism as opposed to an intentional, this is what we want to do choice.
Yeah, Well, I think that's a fairly key thing that Apple almost certainly put the M1 in the iPad because it was a cost-saving exercise to do so.
Yeah.
And it didn't hurt sales either, with lots of people buying it thinking they were getting something more than what they actually were.
Not everyone. Some people just thought, "No, hold on, I'm quite happy with what I've got." If you're new to the channel or if you're new to the podcast, by the way, this is just an ongoing in-joke that...
Because I went out and bought the M1 iPad Pro with the 16 gigs of RAM.
Hoping there would be some kind of revelation about how you could tap into both the 16 gigs of RAM and the power of the M1.
Yeah.
How's that worked out?
Well, it hasn't, has it? It's, I mean, in everyday use compared to the A12X it replaced, it feels no different whatsoever. The screen occasionally goes brighter when you're watching HDR content, but otherwise it's no different, other than it now has a shadow around the edges, and it's heavier.
Yeah.
And it has Thunderbolt, which doesn't work at Thunderbolt speeds.
So I was always intending to get one at some point, but genuinely have never felt the need based on the feedback. And I think that's a really good thing, though, because this is something you can get from the channel, is we'll give you our honest feedback on stuff. And that hopefully will allow you to make informed buying decisions. And there's nothing wrong with getting the latest iPad Pro if that's what you want and can afford. But it's also good to know that you can get perfectly by with one that's 2 generations older.
Yeah, I think it's a case of if you're going out to buy one and you haven't got one already, go ahead. It's amazing. It's an amazing iPad. If you've already got an iPad Pro with the A12X or A12Z in it, why would you bother upgrading? It doesn't make any sense. Just my opinion. And all of this is, of course, just our opinions. And at the end of the day, we don't have any inside track on Apple. And incidentally, folks, neither does anyone else.
Apple does.
Apple does, yeah. And they're not telling. So it's what we're trying to do is come at this from the point of view of what's likely from a commercial perspective as business owners, not of the scale of Apple, obviously. But we do understand the commercial imperative and the need to do things in a certain way. So that's the kind of approach that we're taking, and that's the approach that we're now going to take as we talk about the M2.
Yes. There's a lot of crazy, and I'm putting that moniker on it, crazy M2 rumours percolating.
Interesting. I don't think I would have said crazy whether I deployed the air quotes or not, but
it's just, it goes back to what you were saying earlier. If someone puts M2 Apple Silicon into Google, or YouTube for that matter, what you tend to see is a lot of fait accompli stuff that is definitely going to happen and that it's all going to come out at the March event. I think that's the key thing. It's all going to come out at the March event. And I think, again, just putting on our thinking cap, we could be completely wrong on this and have egg on our face, but that's okay. We're big enough and ugly enough to take it. It just doesn't seem like the right time for M2. Not yet.
I agree with that. I'll be... from my perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if Apple did release M2 because Apple does the surprising. So,
but shall I tell you why I don't think it makes sense?
Go on.
Because it's not that long ago. It's only in the fall that we had the M1 Pro and Max come out. And I think there's still a lot of people out there trying to decide what to have. And I think if you add another chip into the mix right now, it's just going to make that confusion worse when we still haven't had the rollout of things like we've talked about, like the M1 Pros and Macs in bigger iMacs and in the Mac Mini. So the M1 was released in the fall of 2020. I think it makes a lot more sense for the M2 to get its debut in the fall of 2022. So I'm not saying it's not coming, but I don't think it's coming in March. I think possibly the earliest we might start seeing references to it is in WWDC.
Okay. So let me tell you why I think it won't be immediately. And it all depends on where Apple is in their development cycle. But Apple's chip department, its silicon, is built from common building blocks. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. So there's a lot of people who say the M1, for example, is the A14X with a different name. No, it's not. It has completely different stuff in it that's specific to Mac, which can't be used by iPads and iPhones because iOS doesn't support it. So there's functionality within your M1 iPad that your iPad can never use. So yes, the M1 chip, the M chips can run iOS, and they can also run macOS. And indeed, the A chips can technically run macOS, though they miss out on certain features because they don't have support for certain things like virtualization, for example. So they're common building blocks, but they're different designs based on that. And if you think in terms of Lego bricks, that's maybe the right analogy, or perhaps a car that uses a common engine across two different body styles. So that's kind of the setup for Apple Silicon. So the M1 has got the same core designs. So the CPU cores, so Ice Storm, which is the efficiency core, and Firestorm is the performance core. Well, that's the same cores that are used in the A14 Bionic chip. And the M1 has taken that a step further by basically increasing the clock frequency, the addition of the unified memory architecture, and other things that kind of speed that up. Those same core designs are used in the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. It's the same cores. If they bring out an M2 now, which core designs are they going to use? Well, logic would say it will be Blizzard and Avalanche, which are the core designs that were used for the A15 chip. But those cores are made on the same process node as the previous cores, and they really don't offer that much of a performance improvement. Often when you look at the benchmarks and you see the big differences, what you're not always being shown is the fact that, for example, your phone, Pete, the 13 Pro Max, is clocked at 3.2 gigahertz. But if you get the A15 chip in the 13 mini or the iPad mini, it's clocked at 3 gigahertz. So there is a difference. I'm pretty sure the top chip gets an extra graphics core as well, which explains some of that. When you compare these cores like for like with the previous cores, then they're not really that much of an improvement. It's not a night and day improvement. It's a minuscule improvement, really. Would you want to bring out M2 on that basis, using those cores, or would you instead use the cores that the Apple will currently be working on and finalizing, which will end up in the A16 chips? And those particular cores perhaps use a different node size as well, could be using TSMC's 4 nanometer for all we know.
Yeah.
It's going to be a bigger leap in performance, and the timing will also work better.
Yeah, definitely.
Another thing that we need to understand as well is M2 is not above an M1 Pro or an M1 Max. So this is where a little bit of confusion comes in. M2 will replace the standard M1. And if Apple brings out the M2 before the M2 Pro and the M2 Max, they don't want the standard M2 to outperform the M1 Pro. So it's going to need to sit in that middle ground.
Yeah, because if Apple bring out an M2 in spring, but they also say, oh, by the way, we've also got the larger iMac now with an M1 Pro and Max chip in it, people are going to look at it and go, well, one's bigger than two, so that two must be better. When the M2 will not be better than an M1 Pro or Max.
No.
The base M2.
No, not unless they spec it up with the same number of cores, and then it would be an M2 Pro, wouldn't it? Not an
Exactly.
So it's, for lots of reasons, I just can't see why Apple would do it. From commercial reasons and from marketing and consumer viewpoint, it like you said, it creates confusion. Think about the SKUs as well, the product SKUs, and this clearly has been an issue for Apple. Because when they were producing the new iPad Pro, what would have made sense was for them to do an X version or an expanded version of the A14 Bionic that's in the iPad Air.
Yeah.
Which is what they did with the previous, when they did the A12X. So that's what we would expect to happen. But they didn't do that. Instead, they suddenly released this iPad with the M1, and everyone gets all excited thinking, well, surely there must be some new functionality coming to iOS to support this new M1. Well, that never happened. So why did Apple put the M1 in the iPad Pro when really only a handful of apps might ever get close to taking advantage of some of its capabilities? And the simple answer is because they're making them. And making a new design and putting it through manufacture,
quality control, testing, distribution, doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. Just put the M1 in it because it will work. It will run iOS. They couldn't do it the other way around with the Macs, but they can do it this way with the iPad. So it makes perfect sense. But the reason why Apple did that is surely because they have supply chain issues or they've got minimal capacity and they're working with what they've got. So this idea then that they'll suddenly launch yet another SKU, the M2, and replace products that are already selling well and that are only a year old, that to me doesn't seem like a sensible commercial decision, does it?
No,
Pete?
and it feeds into the way that Apple released the iPhone, and the Mac is a different product from the iPhone. You know, it isn't something that you want to be replacing. Not that everyone replaces their phone every 12 months. Some people do, but it's just not that kind of device, and it's an upheaval to replace your computer, even if you have everything on cloud and that, but your peripherals, your setup and everything. So from every way you look at it, even from a financial point of view, which is always going to be the biggest driver for any business, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. That doesn't mean that Apple won't do it, though.
No, it doesn't, but I suppose we probably have got to the point where we need to put some kind of grading on the M2 Rumors for the spring event.
It's very difficult because you never want to be wrong about stuff.
I don't care.
Actually, no, I don't care either. I'm just going to say red. It doesn't make any sense. If Apple do it, then they're doing it because there's other stuff going on that we don't know about. Perhaps they're much more advanced in their core designs and they're much more progressed than we think they might be.
Global supply chain issues suggest that isn't the case, because even if the designs are there, I bet you they can't get them into production yet.
No. And another key factor I think that we should just mention is that Apple makes most of their money from this sort of hardware.
You're waving your phone just for those that aren't watching us on YouTube.
Yeah, sorry, holding up my phone. That's where Apple makes its money. That's what it focuses on. When you go onto Apple's website, the headline graphics, the hero images, it's iPhone.
Yeah,
because that's the money
that's
maker.
the cow of cash, or the cash cow, as some people like to call it.
Indeed, they don't make as much money from Mac, although it is a growing market share. They certainly don't make as much money from the Mac. So you'd think that any Mac silicon or Mac-specific silicon would follow after the iPhone, basically. So they'll do the core development, develop those processor cores predominantly for iPhone, and then they'll make use of them and then develop them onwards for Mac afterwards. That would be my expectation.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And that is, in fact, from an interview with Apple's chip designers, that's kind of what they said. They took the toolbox that was already there and then made it Mac-specific. So,
yeah.
So
well, there we go.
M2 for me is a red. I just... At the spring event, I can't see it. Will we see it later this year? I think if we do, it will be towards the end of the year, but we might get a hint of it at WWDC.
Quite possibly. We'll find out. Anyway.
When it comes to those three computers, Pete,
yeah.
So first of all, is one of them a larger iMac?
Yes.
Green. Will we see that at the spring event?
Yes.
That's the one I'm expecting. So we're probably going to be wrong, but that's what we're expecting. Could one of them be a Mac Mini?
Yes.
Yeah,
Green.
I think so. Green on that. Will we see it at the spring event?
I think we will.
Okay, I'll go amber.
Okay.
And then it's a bit of a toss-up, isn't it, for the last one?
Your guess is as good as mine, folks. What do you reckon? You're going to stick your neck on the block, aren't you? I can tell.
I can see the 13-inch MacBook Pro being discontinued until such time as an M2 is available, and then it could be potentially rebranded as a MacBook, and it would then, with an M2, sit perfectly in that middle ground that we spoke about between the MacBook Air and the M1 Pro MacBook 14. That would make a lot of sense to me, but if we're saying that M2 isn't coming until later in the year, then one of those model numbers could be that, but it might be that we don't see it until the end of the year. A redesigned MacBook Air, I think not yet. I think that would wait for M2.
Yeah, that's reasonable. So it could be that we could have a 27 and a 32-inch iMac accounting for two of the SKUs, and the other one being the Mac Mini.
Could be. Or it could just be one of those SKUs is the MacBook Pro, and they're waiting on the M2 being ready.
The plot thickens.
So that's about as clear as mud, isn't it? But I think we have been quite...
I think we've been very objective and analytical as opposed to sensationalist and clickbaity.
Yeah, okay. Those are just our thoughts, folks, and I'm sure that you guys will have your own opinions, and hopefully you just enjoyed the natter, and maybe it sort of sparked your imagination. You can come up with something better than we have, in which case please share in the comments section. It's going to be interesting. What we're planning to do is to do a live show after the event.
Yeah,
on the main
Can't
channel.
say where it will be or how the production quality will be, because as some of you regular subscribers may know, we are in the process of moving studios, and we don't know quite how the timings will work out. So we'll do something, because that's the way we roll. But how and what and the format it will take might be a bit Heath Robinson.
I'm sure we can figure something out.
We'll be fine.
It's going to be a busy couple of weeks. Anyway, I hope you found the discussion interesting. As I say, put some stuff in the comments section, and we'll endeavour to check out the comments and respond.
Yeah.
And thanks as always for tuning in, for subscribing, for your likes, for your shares. We appreciate it very much, and we'll see you again soon on
The Constant Geekery Podcast. Cheerio.
Cheerio.